איפה האמת? איפה האינטליגנציה? טוב, אבל גדי הוא לא הנושא שלנו, העלה לי קצת את הג'ננה, כמו שאומרים, אבל הסיפור הוא לא גדי. התחלנו מתמיר אימן וגדי טאו, ועכשיו השאלה היא באמת, איך זה קורה להם? איך זה קורה לאנשים הכי חכמים? אני לא מכיר הרבה אנשים כל כך חכמים וכל כך מדויקים. לשמוע את גדי טאו בנושאים אחרים זה תענוג צרוף, זה שמן לאוזניים. וגם הרצאות של תמיר אימן. מה קורה פתאום כשזה מגיע לאיזשהו נושא שבו פתאום האינטליגנציה נעלמת, והיכולת לראות את המציאות נעלמת, ותמיר אימן מספיק אינטליגנטי כדי אפילו לא להודות בזה שהעובדות לא מעניינות, כן? אני אסביר לכם בדיוק איפה הנקודה. אני תמיד חוזר ומספר על, שואל את השאלה, הילד הזה מכפר חב"ד שחסם כבישים, את כביש מספר 1 שם על יד כפר חב"ד, ב-95, באוגוסט 95, במסגרת הפגנות זו ארצנו, כן? או הנערה הזאת שנעצרה בגוש קטיף, נערה באולפנה בת 14, 15, כן? בגוש קטיף, וב-2005, 10 שנים אחר כך. מי הבין את המציאות נכון? הם, הילד והנערה, כל הגנרלים, הפרשנים, ותסלחו לי, התמיר אימנים, וגם הגדי טאובים באותה תקופה, דרך אגב, אוקיי? מי הבין את המציאות יותר נכון? הילדים האלה, המוזרים, האלה שלא מבינים כלום, או כן, בפרספקטיבה קטנה לאחור. הרי תהליך אוסלו, והמשכו ההתנתקות, אלו תהליכים שהובילו את הנוח'בה לקיבוץ בארי, נכון? ב7 לאוקטובר. אז מי הבין את המציאות יותר טוב? הגנרלים והאינטלקטואלים והפרופסורים של מכון INSS, והפרשנים באולפנים, או הילד הזה מכפר חב"ד, הנערה הזאת מגוש קטיף, מי הבין יותר טוב? מי היה מחובר למציאות? מי היה פה המור? ומי היה פה החכם? אני חושב שהתשובה ברורה, נכון? איך זה יכול להיות? מה היה לנערה ולילד של גדי טאוב ותמיר אימן לא היה? אני אומר לכם מה היה להם. היה להם דבר שנקרא אמונה. אמונה באלוהי ישראל, זה מה שהיה להם. אתה לא יכול להבין את המציאות בארץ הקודש ואת המציאות בעם הקודש, ולא מתוך משקפיים של אמונה. מה שקרה לתמיר אימן, ומה שקרה לכל צה"ל, לאורך השנים, לפחות מאז אוסלו ועד היום, הוא התהליך הבא. הרי יש לנו את המאבק הזה, שבין ישראליזציה של המדינה לייהוד שלה, אותו ציטוט שאני חוזר עליו שוב ושוב ולעולם לא אפסיק, של אדריכל אוסלו דוקטור רון פונדק. זה המאבק הבסיסי בתוך החברה הישראלית מראשית ימי הציונות, בוודאי מאז קום המדינה בין שני האתוסים המכוננים הללו, היהודי והישראלי. ידוע שנים רבות. כדי לייצר ישראליזציה של המדינה במקום ייהוד שלה, אנחנו חייבים לפתור את בעיית הביטחון. למה? שימו לב מה שקורה עכשיו. כתוצאה מכך שאנחנו במתקפה ובסכנה קיומית, כולם נהיים יהודים. המסכנים, באמת, הזוועות שחוללו פראי האדם הללו, בקיבוצים הכי שמאלניים, והכי חילוניים, והכי ישראליזציייים, מאשר יהודיזציייים, כן? אלה שרצו לתושבי עזה, והביאו אותם לבתי, שמאל שבשמאל, אוקיי? לשם הם הגיעו ראשונים, מה לעשות? אין לי מושג למה, אין לי מושג איך זה נפל דווקא לשמאל הכי קיצוני. לא יודע ולא נכנס לזה בכלל. אבל מה שברור הוא, כמו שאמרה אחת הנשים שם, שראיתי באיזה ראיון בימים הראשונים, היא אמרה, הם חיפשו יהודים, הם רצו להרוג אותי כי אני יהודייה. בחורה משם, מבארי או מנחל עוז, לא זוכר. זה ברור, הם לא עניין אותם אם אתה שמאל, ימין, אם אתה דתי, חילוני, אם אתה ישראליזציה, אם אתה יהוד של המדינה או יהוד שלנו, לא נתנו עניין, לא עניין אותם. האויב בא עלינו כי אנחנו יהודים, זאת אומרת שהבעיה הביטחונית דוחקת אותנו בעל כורחנו לאן? לזהות היהודית שלנו, לחלק היהודי של המשוואה, אוקיי? אז תמיר רימן ומערכות הביטחון, כולן, מאז אוסלו, מנסות לייצר מצב שמספר סיפור אחר. אין בעיה ביטחונית, אנחנו נקים חומה, אנחנו נקים גדר, אנחנו נקים מערכות טכנולוגיות, כיפת ברזל, קרני לייזר, מפה, משם, מזה, מפה, משם, אוקיי? ונתחבא מאחורי כל זה, נספר לעצמנו סיפור שאין יותר מלחמות לאומיות, אין יותר סכנה קיומית, יש משוגעים משני הצדדים, יש את הפונדומנטליסטים משני הצדדים, את אויבי השלום משני הצדדים, כפי שאמר כבר רבין, ואיתם נסתדר עם הקיצות, צבא של הקיצות, לא צריך יותר טנקים, לא צריך יותר, כן, איומים קטנים של משוגעים שנותרו, כן, שלא מבינים שאנחנו בעידן חדש של שלום ושל פריחה ושל דחיקת האל מן המציאות הגיאופוליטית, כן, והזהויות, זה השנים הללו של אוסלו, שנות ה-90, אלו השנים שבהם הרעיון הפרוגרסיבי החל לשלוט בכיפה בעולם כולו. אוסלו, הביטוי הגיאופוליטי בישראל, של התפיסה הפרוגרסיבית שהחלה לפרוח בשמי תבל כבר אז. והפרוגרס הזה, אגב, זה הביטוי האלים של הפוסט-מודרניזם, המעבר מן הפוסט-מודרניזם אל הפרוגרס, זאת אומרת, מהמציאות של כל אחד והאמת שלו, ולכן גם לרעיון האמוני יש מקום במציאות. תפיסה נאיבית כזאת יפה, לתפיסה של כל אחד והאמת שלי, והישראליזציה ניסתה להכריע את הייהוד של המדינה, להכריע. עברנו לשלב ההכרעה, לשלב האלים, הפוסט-מודרניזם, הפרוגרסיביות היא השלב האלים של הפוסט-מודרניזם. ואוסלו הוא השלב האלים, אותו דבר ההפיכה השיפוטית של ברק, שבאה בדיוק באותם שנים גם כן, זה השלב האלים. אז אנחנו יצרנו באופן אלים, כלומר ניצלנו את כל מוקדי הכוח הישראלים באופן אלים, לא בכוח מכות, גם נתנו מכות למפגינים של זו ארצנו, אבל לא, כשאני אומר אלים אני מתכוון, ניצלנו את הכוח שהצלחנו לרכז בנקודת זמן מסוימת, כדי להכריע באופן, לא להמשיך את הדיאלוג בין הישראלי והיהודי, אלא להכריע ישראליזציה במקום יהוד, בדיוק כפי שהסביר פונדק. ועכשיו אנחנו מאז צריכים לתחזק את המציאות שיצרנו באוסלו, זאת אומרת שאין יותר איום קיומי שדוחק אותנו אל היהדות שלנו. עכשיו בואו נחזור לתמיר רימן. תמיר רימן וכל המערכת הביטחונית ששובטה לתפקידה דרך השער הזה של אוסלו, מי שלא אימץ את הקונספציה של אוסלו, לא הגיע לתפקידו של תמיר רימן ולכל תפקיד אחר. בכל פורום מטכ"ל יש דתי אחד היום, שגם הוא, אלוף זיני, שהוא אלוף מדהים, לא נמצא בתפקיד פיקודי, הוא מכשיר הדרכות וכאלה, אוקיי, אימונים. אז אין, יש לך אחוזים מטורפים של דתיים בבתי העלמין הצבאיים, אם תרצו אני אגיד לכם בדיוק כמה, זה מטורף הפער הזה, ואף לא אחד בתפקיד פיקודי בפורום מטכ"ל, אפילו לא אחד, אוקיי? אז זה שער הכניסה לא רק להנהגה הצבאית, אלא לכל מוקדי הכוח בישראל היום, ונוצרה מנהיגות שכזו בצבא ובכל מקום אחר, אבל עכשיו אנחנו מדברים על הצבא, שהיא זו שתפקידה לתחזק את האשליה הזאת, שאין איום ביטחוני, כזה שדוחק אותנו אל היהדות שלנו, ותמיר רימן הוא חלק מן המערכת הזאת. האם תמיר רימן מבין תוך כדי הדברים, והוא במודע אומר את מה שהוא אומר? לטובתו אני רוצה לטעון שהוא ממש לא קולט את כל העניין הזה, אבל הוא נמצא עמוק, הוא שובת לתפקידו מתוך הקונספציה הזאת, ואת הקונספציה הזאת בדיוק הוא משרת, בין אם הוא מבין את זה ובין אם הוא לא מבין את זה. בסדר? עכשיו, אומר לנו תמיר רימן, מטרידים אותי כל הזמן, עם הטענה שיש איום קיומי, ואני אומר לכם, על סמך מפת האינטרסים שלהם, איך אני מבין את האינטרסים שלהם, כפי שאני מבין את האינטרסים שלי. למה הוא לא יכול להבין את האינטרסים שלהם? כי אם אתה בן אדם מאמין, כפי שאמרתי קודם על הילדה ועל הנערה ועל הילד מכפר חב"ד, כן? אם אתה בן אדם מאמין מבין בן אדם מאמין אחר. בן אדם מאמין, מבין, שכשאתה פועל מתוך אמונה, מפת האינטרסים שלך נראית אחרת. היא נראית אחרת לגמרי. כשאתה פועל מתוך אמונה, כאשר אתה בן אדם מאמין, אתה לוקח ברצינות את איומיו של אדם מאמין אחר. כשהוא אומר אל-אקצא, הוא מתכוון לזה. תמיר אימן לא יכול להבין את זה. תמיר אימן גם לא רוצה להבין את זה. כי ההבנה של הדבר הזה אצל תמיר אימן, שאנחנו על סף מלחמה קיומית, משמעה שכל אוסלו לא נגמר, לא צלח. כל הרעיון המכונן, האוסלואידי, לא צלח. כל הבנת המציאות שהובילה לאוסלו קרסה. וזאת הבנת המציאות של, כלומר, התודעה שעל בסיסה נוצרה כאן הגמוניה שלמה, שכבת הנהגה שלמה. אז מה, אני אחתוך את הענף שעליו יושבת כל ההנהגה הביטחונית הישראלית, אוקיי? וגדי טאוב, נעבור עכשיו לגדי טאוב, אותו סיפור. אותו סיפור מכיוון אחר לגמרי. לגדי טאוב אין אלטרנטיבה לנתניהו. גדי טאוב מבין בשכל שהחבר'ה הללו, גדי טאוב נמצא במקום יותר טוב מהשמאל, זה ברור. הוא בלב האינטליגנציה, נקרא לזה הימנית חילונית, אוקיי? הוא מבין את מפת האיומים וכו'. הוא לא יכול להתכחש לזה. אבל לתת את ההסבר האמוני שאני נותן כאן, הוא לא יכול. הוא לא רוצה, הוא לא יעשה את הצעד הנוסף הזה. אז מי נשאר לו? מי נשאר לו? מול האוסלואיזם הזה, חוץ מביבי? אף אחד. אף אחד. הוא לא יכול לתרגם את המאבק של השמאל בימין, באופן שבו אני עכשיו מתרגם כמאבק של ישראליות מול יהודיות, של חילוניות מול למיות, או כן? אז יש לו את נתניהו, שמנהיג את הימין הישראלי, שלא מתוך הרעיון האמוני. אם הוא לא יודע בכך שנתניהו ואוסלו חד הן, אם הוא לא יודע בכך שנתניהו והכפיפות לאמריקאים חד הן, מה יישאר לגדי טאוב? אתם יודעים מה יישאר לגדי טאוב? תסלחו לי שאני אומר את זה. מה שישאר לגדי טאוב זה משה פייגלין. תראו עד כמה אינטלקטואל מדהים כמו גדי טאוב, עד כמה נמוך מבחינה אינטלקטואלית הוא מצליח להגיע, ואתר מידע מצליחים להגיע, כדי לא להודות באמת, ולא להישאר עם האלטרנטיבה האמונית להנהגת ישראל.
Okay, so today, the 22nd of November, should be a day of mourning and remembrance, really, for the United States, because 61 years ago today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered in public in Dealey Plaza in Dallas. So today's the day, and I thought we could talk about it a bit, seeing as it's an anniversary.
He would be 107 today.
Right, yeah, 107, 180, yeah, he'd be dead anyway. His health wasn't good.
I mean, you've seen Jimmy Carter, maybe not.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, I don't think JFK was going to make old bones. He had some terrible health issues.
Yeah.
Very, very terrible health issues. He was hooked up on all sorts of drugs all the time. Some people said, because it was a different world back then, right? Some people said that nowadays you probably wouldn't get away with it. People would know that you're on tons of medication. And
Well, like with Joe Biden.
good point. It'd be interesting to know exactly who's on more medication out of Joe Biden and JFK.
Or Jimmy Carter.
Or Jimmy Carter, right. Poor bloke.
How much are they pumping into both of those men to keep them alive?
His health was one of the main issues that the administration of his wanted to keep hidden, wasn't it?
JFK, yeah.
Yeah, wasn't that the Camelot image they wanted to create? And
That was a recurring thing for Democrats at the time after FDR, wasn't it?
Yeah. Part of his persona was being young and vibrant and healthy and lively, and it was not the case. He was sort of almost crippled. Quite often, he'd walk around with sticks.
I had no idea about any of this, actually.
Yeah.
That's
also,
really
sometimes he couldn't put his socks. I've read.
Yeah. He was injured in the war, and he had health issues anyway. And yeah, I mean, he's an actual war hero, the man. Anyway, that's just for another story. I'm fascinated by the Kennedy murder. I wrote an article quite a while ago now. When is this?
I don't know why you
January
keep
last
emphasising the murder like people don't know that he got shot in the head.
Because they often call it the JFK killing or the JFK assassination. I feel like it should be people should be remembered it was a murder. Right?
That's fair.
Or the mystery, the JFK mystery. That's one of my angles, is that I don't think it is particularly a mystery. Now, I'm going to talk all about this, and the first thing I want to say is, it's one of those issues, I'm sure we'll get plenty of comments, it's one of those issues where most people have got an opinion, and quite often it's a strong opinion. So I am of the mind that Oswald didn't act alone. I think there was, by definition, more than one person involved, so therefore a conspiracy on some level. Now, it's funny, the range of reaction you get to this, because a lot of people say, of course, like you're stating the obvious, like of course it's more than one person and Oswald didn't act alone, and anyone that looks at it for more than 2 seconds knows that. Like stop being a dummy about it. And then you get other people that are absolutely adamant that it was Oswald alone, and the official narrative, the Warren Commission says, is just true, essentially. I mean, even the BBC, not that long ago, a few years back, put out a documentary debunking all the conspiracy theorists, saying that it was Lee Oswald. So, if you're one of those people that insist that it was still Oswald, although how Oswald could have really changed the route of the motorcade, I don't know, as well as a million other things. But nonetheless, we will be going down the rabbit hole of it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone out of pure resentment towards Jack Kennedy. Okay, so I wrote this article, Dealey Plaza's Telltale Heart, a reference to Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart that keeps beating even after death and haunts people. I think the world is still haunted by the JFK murder in all sorts of ways. Because you sort of know deep down in your heart that there was something amiss that day in Dealey Plaza. What it says, first and foremost, is we, whoever was behind it, we can and will kill the sitting president of the United States in public if needs be. So you're not safe. If we'll do that to John Kennedy, we'll do it to everyone. Right? Nobody's safe. That's one of the things it says, right? So, okay, I wrote an article about that. And where's the next link? Who's doing my link?
If you would press that.
Okay, so I've talked about it before in various bits of content. One time I spoke to Dan Carlin. Thank you. Spoke to Dan Carlin one time. There's a clip there from my own channel, History Bro. Check out History Bro. You do the next link?
Yep.
But also, we made that article I wrote. One of our fans kindly made a video out of it. The video editing on this is far beyond my capability.
Oh, I did not mean to do that.
Oh, just play it there. Movie. Play this.
Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up?
Okay, the answer is he had simply gathered too many enemies.
You can pause that.
Organised. So that was the great Donald Sutherland in Oliver Stone's JFK. And I say in the article that's my favourite part of that film because it really cuts to the quick. It really gets to the nub of things. There's one thing to endlessly talk about how many shooters there were on Dealey Plaza, endlessly talk about, whether they were Corsican shooters, whether they were mafia, whether they were the Cuba connection, the exact individuals in the Secret Service or in JFK's own government or in the CIA. But the real question is why? Why did somebody or some people feel the need for Jack Kennedy to need to be dead? So that's what the bulk of that article and that video is about, is talking about that. And I don't want to talk about that too much in this video because you can go and watch that. And
what's your hypothesis?
well, you're in the height of the Cold War, arguably the height of the Cold War, the early 60s, right, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Kennedy brothers, Robert Kennedy Sr. as well, part of this, had made a giant number of enemies, starting with the mob, people like Giancana or Trafficante, the most powerful mob guys he'd made dire enemies of, the brothers had. Loads and lots of people in the deep state, from the Rockefeller brothers, David and Nelson, through to all sorts of oil interests, through to many generals, people like you might know the names of someone like Curtis LeMay or Lyman Lemnitzer, if anyone knows these people, generals, very, very powerful generals, people that were extremely senior in the State Department or National Security Advisor level people. There's two brothers, Mac and Bill Bundy, for example. Dean Rusk, I think Dean Rusk may well be in on it, allegedly, as Secretary of State at one point. And, of course, the CIA. He'd made enemies of the CIA. Specifically, the head of the CIA was Alan Dulles. And he basically fired him, stopped him being the leader of the CIA and sort of give him a medal and kind of kicked him upstairs a little bit. The Cabell brothers, Charles P. Cabell, a general, and his brother, Earl Cabell, who just happened to be the mayor of Dallas. Just happened to be that. Various spies, people like Davey Atlee Phillips, Cord Meyer, people that were super high up in the CIA, like Frank Wisner or Dick Helms, Richard Helms, James Angleton, James Jesus Angleton.
So everybody you don't want to be enemies with, he was enemies with.
Extremely powerful people. And in the end, people that do assassinations, he'd made enemies of.
Like the CIA.
So there's a guy called Douglas Dillon. Most people probably never heard of Douglas Dillon. C. Douglas Dillon. It's people like this that I think were behind it ultimately. So do you want me to just tell you what I think happened?
Yeah, please.
Whether we can end up putting this on YouTube or not. But so I think that the original impetus came from Alan Dulles. Sometimes you think that people that might contrive these sorts of things are just sort of pure evil, just complete monsters, so that you can barely put a human face to it. But then that is the banality of evil, right? That it comes down to just normal guys that just wear trousers and socks and shoes and go to the toilet and comb their hair and are just a human being. Yeah. Can you go to the first pictures that I've got there?
Can we get the thing back up on the screen? Thank you.
So, well, keep going down to Alan Dulles. Look, so, in my opinion, the guy that was the prime mover in assassinating a sitting president and making a whole generation of people cynical and that we still live in the shadow, was just a guy called Alan who smokes a pipe.
I was going to say, he smokes a pipe, he can't be that bad a guy.
It's just Alan. It's just a bloke. Of course, he's not just...
I'm sure that's how he introduced himself to people as well. How would you prefer... Oh, just Alan.
Alan, what do you do? I'm just a bloke. No biggie. No, but he's one of the most powerful people, among the most powerful people in the world, being the head of the CIA in the 50s, early 60s. It's an old OSS guy. He was the CIA in all sorts of ways. And people said, there's a very, very interesting book, even though it is by a bit of a lefty, called The Devil's Chessboard. Talks all about Dulles in some detail. And there's accounts where people say, when he would enter sort of a dinner party or something in the Georgetown circuit, he sort of shimmered with power. He was one of those people, sometimes you might be able to see it a bit with maybe an early Blair, or even an early George Bush Jr. actually. They sort of exuded authority and power, but him obviously in a very dangerous way. He thought of himself, or said that he was a Secretary of State for unfriendly nations. Okay, so in the 50s and 60s, they were involved in assassinations. I mean, it's just a matter of record, just 100% the case. For example, just to scratch the surface, there's like DM in Vietnam, the leader, they got him killed. Lubumba in Congo, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. They tried to whack the beard, Fidel, a number of times. So it's one of the things they did. It's one of the things the CIA did. Perhaps still do, certainly did do. Would have assassination teams. And there's many more as well when you look into it. Look, there's Alan with Jackie Boy. They were ideologically opposed. Alan's an old Cold Warrior. All these guys I mentioned, like the Cabell brothers, they're Cold Warriors. Their worldview is that the United States needs to defeat the evil Soviets and global imperialist Comintern-style communism, and that the United States should be the leader of the world. So that, but by any means necessary, sort of thing. That's not really what JFK thought. JFK said in all sorts of speeches, even before he was president. No, the worst thing in the world is imperialism, whether it's American capitalistic type in dollar imperialism or whether it's Soviet imperialism. They're both bad and evil, and we shouldn't do that. Well, that's not what Cold Warriors like. And he screwed with their money as well, setting Bobby to break up the stranglehold that the mafia had on all sorts of things, failing to get rid of Castro because both the company and the mob made loads and loads of money in Cuba in the Batista era, loads and loads of money, gambling, prostitution, drugs, loads of stuff. Well, when Fidel got in, like him or loathe him, he put an end to all of that sort of thing. That screws with the money of some extremely powerful people. Failing to sort of look after companies like the United Fruit Company and stuff. Just not helping out the global imperial project for the United States. That puts him on the wrong side of these old Cold Warrior types. So, I think that's the why. There he is, basically firing Alan Dulles, giving him a medal, and saying, be an elder statesman, but you're not in control of the CIA anymore, sort of thing. Now, Alan Dulles was extremely, extremely powerful. He had a brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, so the equivalent of our Foreign Secretary. This is sort of under Truman, in the Truman years. So for a few years there, the Dulles brothers controlled, nominally at least, controlled nearly all foreign policy. John Foster Dulles is sort of the legitimate side of foreign affairs, foreign relations, and his little brother Alan controlling all the dirty secret side of everything. And he had a giant nexus of connections, everything from publishing, obviously the intelligence services, all sorts of... So one of his best friends was Douglas Dillon, C. Douglas Dillon, who was, a number of things, but in the end, Secretary for the Treasury. Just so happens that back then, I'm pretty sure it's not the case anymore, but back then, all of the Secret Service came under the control of the Department of the Treasury, of all things. Don't ask me why that was. I don't know. But that's how it was back then. Whoever's in control of the Treasury essentially was the boss of the Secret Service. Now, Douglas Dillon and Alan Dulles were literally best friends, to the point where they went on holiday with each other all the time. They'd go and spend time at David Rockefeller's estate or each other's estates, and they were thick as thieves, absolutely thick as thieves. So, okay, this is what I think happened. Just in pure theory, and it's all alleged, because I've got no actual insight. I think this is what happened. Alan Dulles wants to whack JFK. Now, he goes to his killers at the CIA, like James Angleton. If you go to the next, I think we've got that's Jim Angleton. Years after, actually. James Jesus Angleton. He'd go to someone like Angleton or Bissell, Richard Bissell or Frank Wisner. He'd go to one of these guys, maybe Dick Helms, who later became the head of the CIA. And he'd say, I'm considering whacking JFK. Whether they'd have to be on board. If I did want to do something like that, how is that? Is it possible?
Hypothetically.
Yeah.
You went with the Ben Shapiro. Hypothetically speaking.
Could we put a team together to do that? Someone like James Angleton says, sure. Oh, Jim Angleton, what secrets did you take to the grave with you? Who knows? So he said, yeah, we can do that. So then he'd go to somebody, there's people further down, people like I mentioned already, people like Cord Meyer or Bill Harvey.
Who's this
That's
gentleman?
Bill Harvey. Bill Harvey was a bit of a crazy man, really. He was super high up in the CIA, like sort of second, third tier CIA. He was thrown out of the FBI for being too much of a loose cannon. So the CIA took him on. He'd threaten people all the time, personally. There's one story in Spycatcher where a really, really senior MI5 guy goes over and waist pocket and like threatens. He's drunk in really high level meetings and shouting and swearing. Crazy man. So you go to Bill Harvey. Angleton maybe goes to Bill Harvey and says, put together a kill team. We need shooters. Now, where they really got them for, again, there's some people said there was some Corsican shooters, maybe French shooters. Maybe that you get people, professional assassins from Europe that come over to the United States, do the job and go straight back to Europe and never return. It may be something like that happened. Maybe they were just straight up mob guys. I happen to think there were a number of shooters in Dealey Plaza. I happen to think there was at least 3 shooters. I don't think Lee Oswald himself was one of them. I think he was in the book depository building, but I don't think he was firing a gun that day. He was either a spotter or exactly what he said he was, a patsy. I think Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy, which is not a fashion way of just saying a scapegoat. Just a stooge to take the blame for something.
So if he was a patsy, he'd been positioned
Yeah, exactly.
into the book depository so that he could later be picked up and
Exactly.
fingered with all of the other evidence they found with him.
I think very quickly to say, because this is a massive rabbit hole, I could spend ages on this, just to say a few words about Lee Oswald. He is a crazy, fascinating figure. He's definitely involved in the intelligence services. But at a low level, he wasn't very old. He was in his early 20s still. He was sort of a wannabe. He was in the US Marine Corps, picked out quite early as being intelligent. And then he worked for a while in Japan, just ground crew or analysis stuff for the U-2 spy missions. Then he decided to defect to the Soviet Union. Like you just do that in 1960 or whenever it was. The Soviets take him in. The intelligence services were trying to plant him in Russia to see if he could find anything out. But the Russians, far too savvy with that for that. We're just like, yeah, okay, bro, we'll give you a flat somewhere in sort of Russia somewhere, but we're not letting you anywhere near state secrets. We're not going to use you as sort of a KGB asset or anything like that. They saw it a mile away. So anyway, not after too long, a year or 2 or 3 or something in Russia, he defects back. He comes back to the United States. He's got a Russian wife, incidentally. He marries a Russian woman there. He comes back, and when he comes back, they just immediately let him in to America and just be normal again and have a job. And so that stinks to high heaven. That absolutely stinks to high heaven. He is part of the intelligence apparatus on some level. He's involved in that world and that game. So the people have said the fingerprints of intelligence are all over Lee Oswald, absolutely all over it. But the evidence, the physical evidence, seems that he couldn't have been on that high up floor shooting a rifle that day, because he was seen somewhere else. I don't want to get into the weeds of all the details, but it's physically
He does want to.
It's not really physically possible that he was able to sort of be in 2 places at once, because he was seen much lower in the building. There's not time for him to have come down in the elevator or run down the stairs and be completely unflustered drinking a can of Coke moments after the shots rang out. I think he's absolutely fine, but I think he was exactly what he said he was, a patsy. Anyway, so that's enough on Lee Oswald. So I think Alan Dulles goes to his CIA guys and say, what if put a kill team together? They say fine. Next, he'll go to someone like Douglas Dillon and say, if we were going to do this, at any point, if any of these senior guys within the conspiracy say no, it's going to be a no. But they all say yes. He goes to someone like Douglas Dillon and says, if we needed to get the CIA to, the Secret Service, sorry, to sort of change the motorcade route, if we need to do that, if we need to make sure that there's not a bulletproof bubble on the president's limousine, if we need to make sure the two guys standing either side of the limousine are sort of called off at the last minute, we're going to need you, Dylan, to do that sort of thing. There's a clip there. Can we go straight to the clip, the YouTube clip?
That's a horrifying image there. Carrying on.
I've got a YouTube clip.
Yeah,
play this. Plays this.
Do you mind playing this,
That's JFK and Jackie in the motorcade, guys jogging alongside a Secret Service detail, and look, they're told, stop.
Examine the scene 4 more times.
Stop running alongside the limousine, and the guys are going, what? Why? Yeah, you get the point. You don't need to watch it anymore.
Mm-hmm. And then
Lee Harvey Oswald hasn't got the power to do that. It could not have been Lee Harvey Oswald on his own. People that insist that, when you say to them, well, what about the changing of the route and getting the CIA to do that? So what about all the sorts of problems with the commission after the fact? Did Lee Harvey Oswald from the grave pick exactly the right people to sit on the Warren Commission, did he? Okay, so I haven't got much time. I've already wasted loads of time here. Some of the pictures were some of the people I was talking about. If you go back a few, like there's LBJ. That's Douglas Dillon. Dick Helms.
Who on earth is that?
Who is that?
BioGuide Congress.gov.
Who is that a picture of? Not sure.
It doesn't say.
Okay.
Mystery. Another one of the mysteries.
I think that was one of the Cabell brothers, actually. I think that was Earl Cabell.
Oh, all right.
He was the mayor of Dallas. Anyway. Okay, so, and then it goes to someone like Douglas Dillon, then he'll go to someone like the Cabell brothers saying, can we make this happen? Then he'll go to someone like LBJ. LBJ sort of had to be in on it on some level, because after it all goes down, you need to be able to control the narrative afterwards. And in this case, the Warren Commission will pick someone who's whiter than white, Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Chief Justice. So he really wasn't in on it. He couldn't have been. He's whiter than white. But we'll get someone like that to lead this commission, and then we'll paint the narrative that there's this lone killer, and that'll be the end of it. And the killer the quote-unquote killer, really needs to have died that day. I think it was a mistake that he lived. When they realised he'd lived and he'd
started speaking about it.
They needed him dead straight away. So they get
Chat Ruby.
Jacob Leon Rubenstein to murder him.
More accurately, yes.
Yeah, no, that is his name, Jacob Rubenstein. To sort of literally come out of the shadows and be judge, jury, and executioner. No need for any justice. No need for a trial. Don't worry about anything.
Before this, who was Jack Ruby?
Okay, so he owned a nightclub.
Mm-hmm.
He was an associate of the mob, so he's not a made man. He couldn't be a made man. He was son of Polish people.
Mm. So he wasn't Italian. So.
No. He was Jewish, and so he was an associate.
Perpetrators of horrific murder cases are predominantly male, which inevitably draws more attention to heinous crimes involving female murderers. However, a particularly atrocious murder case in South Korea in 2014 demonstrated that women, although appearing fragile and beautiful externally, can harbor a profoundly dark side. A particularly shocking aspect of this case was the weapon of choice, a chainsaw. Furthermore, the assailant vented her anger on a man with whom she had no prior animosity, only to audaciously accuse the victim of violating her afterward. Today we delve into the Paju chainsaw murder case. Komi-suk was a 35-year-old woman who frequently uploaded suggestive photos on her social media, baited men, and engaged in transactional romantic relationships via direct messages. Komi-suk was extremely angered when a man who had been financially supporting her decided to unilaterally end their relationship. Could it have been because she felt that men exploited her for transactional relationships and then discarded her? Despite her boiling rage, she sought out another man. On May 25, 2014, she messaged a seemingly ordinary man in his 50s on a paid adult chat site, saying, "Shall we be lovers who care for and love each other?" She seduced the man and successfully arranged a meeting. The agreed upon price for the encounter was 300,000 won. Regrettably, this man told his wife that he was going to Seoul for a job interview and left the house, only to meet an unexpectedly grim fate. After meeting on a road near the Paju Unification Observatory, they drove to a remote motel in Komi-suk's Chrysler in just 10 minutes. After making the victim undress, Komi-suk, under the pretext of preparing for intercourse, instructed him to close his eyes. She then took out a 30-centimeter long kitchen knife, which she had previously prepared in her bag, and first stabbed him in the neck, followed by approximately 40 other stab wounds, ultimately resulting in his death. Many people suspected that she had a criminal history because she did not administer alcohol or drugs to the victim before committing the crime. However, according to official police records, she had a criminal history because she stabbed him in the neck, followed by approximately 40 other stab wounds, ultimately resulting in his death. Many people suspected that she had a criminal history because she did not administer alcohol or drugs to the victim before committing the crime. However, according to official police records, Komi-suk was a first-time offender. The kitchen knife, with a handle and blade of equal length, might have been carried by Komi-suk for self-defense, given her profession as an escort. However, the black tape wrapped around the handle of the confiscated knife suggested she knew the handle could slip during stabbing, causing injury to the assailant's hand. Her skillful and swift stabbing of a sober man's neck, causing instant death, also indicated her familiarity with crime-related materials. After stabbing the chest area 41 times, Komi-suk moved the corpse to the bathroom to drain the blood, reducing its weight. After changing her clothes and extending her room rental, she bought 2 bags to store the upper and lower body parts separately, and purchased a chainsaw and spade for burial at a hardware store. The store owner, surprised by a woman in a black miniskirt buying a chainsaw, asked its intended use. She calmly said it was for her father in the countryside. Komi-suk, strikingly beautiful and thus not arousing suspicion, then bought rings and necklaces worth 3 million won at an Ilsan jewelry store using the victim's credit card. On May 28, 2014, 2 days after the murder, she tried buying 5 million won worth of valuables at the same store. The owner, finding it odd, asked for her ID. She canceled the purchase, disappeared, and went to another store. She then swiped the card, returned to the motel, and dismembered the corpse. She put the upper body, head attached, in one bag, and the lower body and legs in another, cutting the buttocks and knee joints to fit them into the bag. Komi-suk used the victim's credit card to buy mist, which she sprayed generously to eliminate the blood smell from the bedding and room. She then thoroughly cleaned the room with detergent to erase all murder traces. It was clear that Komi-suk was fully aware of her actions and was actively strategizing to avoid capture. However, the soon-dispatched police later confirmed a substantial amount of luminal blood reaction all around the room. At the time of the police raid, the presence of other guests in the room immediately following the murder complicated the investigation, which could have made evidence collection extremely challenging. Though she eventually was caught because she drove her own car and abandoned the body, Komi-suk audaciously engaged in additional encounters with other clients after the murder. Oddly, despite having all necessary tools for murder and disposal, she spared and released her subsequent clients. On the night of May 29, 2014, she disposed of the lower half of the torso in a concealed area of a rural road in Paju and left the upper half against a factory wall in the Namdong Industrial Complex, Incheon. 2 days later, a factory worker finishing the night shift discovered a travel bag with a foul odor and swarming flies, and he immediately reported it to emergency services, leading to Komi-suk's capture. The victim, who lost contact after leaving for a job interview on the 26th, was already reported missing and under investigation. The police had identified Komi-suk as a prime suspect, and she had purchased 3 million won worth of jewelry with the victim's credit card on the 27th. Incheon Namdong Police Station's violent crime team identified Komi-suk's vehicle through CCTV footage and urgently arrested her at her residence, an office tower in Ilsan. Despite her careful planning, Komi-suk left behind long hair strands and fingernail fragments on the red cloth used to wrap the body. The irrefutable evidence captured on CCTV included her carrying the body out of an unmanned motel, as well as the locations where she disposed of the body. Using the deceased man's card, Komi-suk went to a nearby shopping mall and bought accessories. Astonishingly, she used the victim's card to purchase the bag and electric saw used for body disposal. Initially, she confessed to the murder, stating it was because the man tried to sexually assault her and not for money. However, the police believe she committed the crime to buy jewelry. Yet, Komi-suk is not an easy person to interpret. At the time of her arrest, she sported the fashionable Cleopatra hairstyle and was adorned with luxury brands. Despite her residence costing 1 million won monthly and being filled with unopened luxury items, she had not paid rent, maintenance fees, and even her water supply was cut off. At the police station, she claimed she killed the man accidentally because he tried to confine her or touch her body parts, reversing the blame onto the victim while meticulously concealing her identity as an escort. Aware that shifting the blame for the assault onto the victim would naturally Today's case is about the kidnapping and murder of the only daughter of a popular Taiwanese television star, which illustrates how personal tragedies can quickly become public. This was a case in which many held the police and the media accountable for their ineffectiveness. This led to further losses as the situation spiraled out of control. Let's dive into today's story. This is the devastating case of Bai Xiaoyan. Bai Xiaoyan was the only daughter of Taiwan's talented celebrity Bai Bingbing and a Japanese writer, Ikki Kajiwara. She had a tall and thin frame of a lady with a short haircut. Even though her parents were famous, Bai Xiaoyan lived a normal life. Her mother, Bai Bingbing, fondly remembered what a kind and tender person she was. She remembered a time when Bai Xiaoyan offered to show a lost stranger how to get somewhere, and Bai Bingbing had to chase her down and caution her against approaching strangers. "You think the worst of people, Mom." Bai Bingbing quoted her daughter's reply in pained voice. On April 17, 1997, 16-year-old Bai Xiaoyan was getting ready to go to school. She had a routine of setting an alarm for her mother before heading off to school. Bai Bingbing remembered how Bai Xiaoyan entered her room and set an alarm on that old ring clock for her. During her half-asleep state, Bai Bingbing watched as her daughter kissed her goodbye and left her room. She saw how much Bai Xiaoyan had grown into a young lady. That thought filled her with warmth and anxiety at the same time. The day went on as usual.
multiculturalism in Europe is a disaster. It's also a disaster in Germany. Now, we are looking at a particular report that was published this August that says that shocking federal police stats indicate more than 2,100 crimes per day in Germany in 2023. They say the number of crimes committed in Germany has risen to its highest rate since 2012, according to the federal police's report. The total number of crimes was close to 800,000. It's 790,245. And they say, announcing the report at a press conference on Monday, Federal Police Chief Dieter Roman added a shocking number to the already distressing figure, saying that in relation to the total population, non-Germans are statistically 6 times more likely to resort to knives in an attack than German citizens. And in sexual crimes, non-Germans.
Right.
And in sexual crimes, it is 7 times more likely. So it's basically what everyone would expect. As German, and we see here, they are focusing also in trains. They're saying violence is
Arab nation in the 70s, in fact. So, hey guys, I want you to look at this beautiful landscape of Afghanistan. What a lovely country. Now close your eyes. Keep them closed. Okay, open them, and oh my god, it just got taken over by the Taliban. If there's one word that many Westerners associate with Afghanistan, it's war. Also poverty, bombs, terrorism.
In a private social club, a lively debate was about to begin. Club members were fixated on a discussion about cars. The question was whether these new horseless carriages could ever replace the horse. But it wasn't much of an argument, because most of these club members agreed that the car was a fad, a trend that would only temporarily remain relevant before people came to their senses. Now, this might seem silly today, but honestly, at the time, most believed it. This was 1903. Almost nobody owned a car. For the most part, they were just too expensive. The cheapest budget models would usually cost $650 or so, which was about a year and a half of the average worker's salary. And this was the low-end stuff. If you wanted a nicer vehicle, that might cost 10 times as much as what most people would make in a year. These were for the wealthy, and even then, not everybody had one. Because the reality was, they weren't really that useful. People had horses and carriages, and society was built around this. You generally lived and worked in the same town. If you needed to go across the country or another state, you just used the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad could get you from coast to coast in 3.5 days. The car couldn't get you from coast to coast ever. Very few roads in the United States were paved, because why would they need to be? Outside of the major cities, you generally expect to find a dirt path. And out west, in the most undeveloped regions miles from civilization, a car was useless. Even in the cities, in the ideal circumstances, these cars were extremely unreliable. If you wanted to just take a drive for even a few miles, it wouldn't be too unexpected to have some mechanical failure or need a repair along the way. This is a time before any standards of what a car should even be existed. Some models had electric engines, some steam, and some powered by gasoline. Sometimes the steering wheel was on the left side, or the right, or you might not even have one. Some cars had 3 wheels, some 4, and most cars didn't have doors or roofs or windshields. They were seen as unsafe, a nuisance for pedestrians and cyclists alike. Some states went as far as passing laws to ban cars, or at least limit their use with extreme restrictions. An automobile back then was this uncommon, expensive, impractical means of transportation that was seen as little more than a status symbol for the wealthy. They were not seen as legitimate competition to horses. Now, as this debate went on, a guest at the club decided to chime in. His name was Horatio Nelson Jackson. He was not from San Francisco, he was from Vermont. Years prior, he had been a doctor but fell ill to tuberculosis and left his practice behind. He was in town because he was heading home after searching for gold and silver in Alaska and Mexico. Horatio liked cars. You could call him something of a motoring enthusiast. He wasn't an expert by any means, or even a proficient mechanic. He was just a fan, and he didn't take too kindly to somebody trash talking about this cool new technology. He believed that the car could replace the horse. It had potential, and he would prove it to these naysayers. So he made a bet. The wager was for $50, and he claimed he would get a car and drive it from San Francisco to New York City in under 90 days. This seemed unreasonable to the members of the club because it had never been done before, and people had tried. Every car manufacturer would love to have made the first car to drive across the country, and some had gone through great planning and expense to try and make it happen, but they never could. It was just too difficult. The infrastructure did not exist. How could you cross the Great Plains? What if the car broke down? How would you get repairs in a timely manner? Even with seemingly unlimited funds and months of meticulous planning, these corporate-sponsored teams couldn't come close to driving across the United States. And then this guy, this random guy, is betting that he'll be the first to do it. With no experience, or training, or motivation beyond the fact that he wants to do it. So they accepted the bet. A $50 wager might seem a bit low for such a massive endeavor, and that's because it was. Don't get me wrong, $50 was still a lot of money in 1903. It would be the equivalent of around $1,700 in 2023. Horatio's wife was traveling with him at the time, and when he told her about this bet, she surprisingly didn't seem to mind. She wasn't going to ride along with him. She just took the train back to Vermont. He was going to need somebody to join him in this adventure, though, because, you know, he wasn't a mechanic, but he knew one. Sewell K. Crocker, a 22-year-old former bike racer turned auto mechanic. Now, there's some discrepancies of whether Sewell and Horatio knew each other well before this adventure. Some statements claim Sewell taught Horatio and his wife to drive cars before, but regardless, Sewell was coming along. He suggested that Horatio should buy a 1903 Winton touring car, which he believed to be the most reliable model around. It was a fancy car, and it came at a price. Since this was a fancy car, not a lot of people had this specific model, especially out west. Most of the time, people would order cars directly from the factory, so you weren't really gonna find something like this at a local car dealership. Luckily, a Wells Fargo executive in San Francisco had that exact model and offered it to Horatio for $3,000. This was about $500 over the list price, and the car already had quite a few miles on it. The tires were not in great shape, but Horatio bought it anyway. If you were wondering, $3,000 in 1903 money would be like $100,000 today, which is pretty expensive and excessive when you consider that this is in an attempt to win a $50 bet. Now, the reason Horatio had this kind of money is all because his wife's family was incredibly wealthy. They got their fortune from something called a celery curial, whatever that was, and he was going to need that money because this was going to be expensive. He named his expensive new car the Vermont because he was from Vermont. Makes sense. Over the next few days, he got some supplies, plopped those in the back of the car, and just 4 days after making this bet, Horatio and Crocker set out on a journey. With no expertise or preparation, these two were going on the first cross-country road trip in American history. Horatio may not have had a plan on how he was going to get to New York, but he did have a general strategy in mind. He wanted to avoid the roughest terrain, the mountains, the deserts, so from San Francisco, they just went north. Pretty quickly, the true scale of this challenge became apparent. Almost immediately, the car needed repairs, and it would continue to need repairs every few miles. The Winton's top speed was a humble 30 miles per hour, but it wasn't like they were going to reach that on the rough roads in the west. This was going to be a slow journey. As they went through the first few towns, they started to get quite a bit of attention from the locals, not because they were trying to make history by crossing the United States in a car. No, it was just because they had a car. Cars weren't common, even in the cities, so most people in these small towns had never seen one of these things. They didn't even know if they would see one again. Every time these guys would show up in a small town, it would be a big story. The newspapers would report that a car was coming to town, so people would line up and down the streets. Kids would try to get out of school. The whole town would stop what it was doing just to try and see these two guys driving a car. They'd ask for rides. It would be a big event. Rumors would spread across the countryside. A cars coming to town, and this just brought a huge surge of excitement through these rather isolated communities. A lot of people didn't really know what these things were, or what they were capable of, and because of that, some seem to have some pretty grand expectations. There's reports that people expected this car to zoom through the center of town at like 90 miles per hour. It was going to be so fast you couldn't even see it. The car was also a sensation since Horatio and Crocker might have to spend a few nights at each location because the car was breaking down constantly. Some repairs were simpler than others, and maybe a blacksmith could throw something together, but if some specialty part broke, the only way to get a replacement was to contact the manufacturer and wait for them to ship it across the country, which might take a few days. They had to stop for supplies frequently too, as much of their stuff would fly off the car since it was a pretty bumpy ride. Even if they had 3 months to make this journey, I don't think anybody genuinely expected them to get to New York City on time. As they got further away from the western coast, they saw less and less people. The roads turned into trails, which turned into untamed wilderness. If they ran into a shallow creek, they might be lucky to drive through it, but more than likely they'd have to bring out the old block and tackle to get this car unstuck through the thick mud. If there was a boulder in the way, you gotta move the boulder. Every few miles had some sort of obstacle. Getting traction was a challenge. It might require ripping up fences and getting those under the car. Without road signs, or roads, it was difficult for these guys to figure out where exactly they were going, which sometimes resulted in some backtracking until they found their bearings. The best case scenario was to run into the railroad tracks, which they could then take to cross some of the more difficult terrain. In the lesser populated areas, they would come across people who hadn't seen another human in weeks, and relied on their generosity for lodging and food. But sometimes, nobody was around. They might go days without eating, and this all became pretty dangerous when you consider the possibility that the car was constantly breaking down. On occasion, the car would just come to a halt, and there was no easy way to fix it on the road, so they'd have to hope that somebody would just come along and find them. At one point, this assistance came from a guy on a horse, who then had to tow the car back to town with his horse. Because this is 1903, obviously there weren't any gas stations. They'd have to find local shops that sold fuel for farm equipment and hope that they didn't get swindled by opportunistic businessmen. The weather could also be quite an issue. Even just driving normally, the crew wore goggles since, there wasn't a windshield. But without a door, without any protection, they were stuck in the rain, thunder, or worse, with nowhere to run. Most days Horatio wrote back to his wife, who he called Swipes for some reason. He kept telling her, well, it's been pretty rough so far, but I'm sure once we get to the next town, it's gonna be a lot easier. And he just kept saying that for every new town, and it never got easier. In the most remote regions of the sparsely populated West, the car became even more of a spectacle. Sometimes too much of a spectacle. They encountered a man who had likely never seen or even heard of a car before, and he was so scared by this mysterious oncoming vehicle that he scrambled to set his horses free. He thought it was a train that had derailed, and it was coming straight for him. Horatio left his jacket in a hotel in Idaho, and when he realized that, he drove back to the town to retrieve it. When he got there, a man asked him if he wanted a new mascot for his journey. It was a dog. His name was Bud. Bud was a good dog. He traveled the countryside wearing these goggles, and people just loved him. Why wouldn't they? He was a dog riding a car. To get from San Francisco to Cheyenne, it took 42 days. At that pace, the prospect of making it across the country in under 90 days seemed less realistic, but they carried on anyway. You see, this road trip was about to turn into a race. On June 20th, 2 other men set out from San Francisco with the same plan as Horatio and Crocker. They were going to drive to New York City, but they had some big names backing them up. The Packard Motor Car Company was sponsoring their trip, and this was all planned well before Horatio made his bet. Every aspect of the route, the placement of supplies, repairs, it was all planned in detail. In fact, they were so confident in their success that this was really more of a publicity stunt. They would take breaks waiting for film to arrive to capture the moment. This was all to show off that Packard's cars could make the journey, and the crew didn't even need to consider it much of a race. Horatio and Crocker didn't have that backing, and they certainly didn't have this planned out. Then on July 6th, Another team sponsored by Oldsmobile also left San Francisco. This was now a three-way race, but Horatio and Crocker had no idea at the time they were even in one. They were in the middle of the country and just hadn't gotten the news yet. The problem now was that the Packard team was actually about to overtake them in a few days. Without having to worry about waiting for repairs, with all of this actually planned in advance, they were moving at nearly twice the rate as Horatio and Crocker. Now, once the two found out they had some competition, it didn't really change anything. Horatio was still confident that he could not only make it to New York City, but he would win this race that he just found out he was a part of. I love this man. As they finally made it to the Midwest, they started getting some different reactions. It wasn't the car getting the attention now. Cars were far more common the further east you went, but Horatio and Crocker, and especially Bud, had gotten pretty famous over the past few weeks. They had made it a decent way across the country and had tackled the most difficult part of their journey. The further they moved east, the better the roads would be, and they'd actually have access to more parts and lodging and food. While it wasn't going to be easy, they had shown they were definitely capable of getting to New York City. It was no longer really a question of whether they'd make it, it was just when. The Winton Company, the manufacturer who made Horatio's beloved car, contacted the team and offered to sponsor the rest of their journey. They would have access to all the resources they would need: supplies, parts, repairs, and the trip would become significantly easier. Horatio declined this. The other two teams with sponsors might have started off strong, but now they were having their own issues. The Packard Company pretty much had this in the bag. They were about to pass Horatio within just a few days. The marketing team for the Packard Company didn't plan a route of convenience or ease. Instead, they picked the most photogenic path, which meant going into canyons and even the Rocky Mountains. Without roads in these early cars, this was nearly impassable, especially in a reasonable time frame, and it slowed them down to a point where they pretty much lost any chance of winning. As for the Oldsmobile team, well, they started so late they were probably never going to win anyway. By the time Horatio and Crocker, and of course Bud, got to the east, it was clear they were about to win. So now, every stop they made resulted in huge crowds, tons of publicity, because this was history being made. It was clear that they were going to be the first people to cross the country in a car, and they were. On July 26th, they made it to New York City at 4:30 in the morning. The plan was to cross the country in 90 days. The journey took 63. Of course, the crew was treated as national heroes. The Vermont was now a modern marvel. This machine had taken men from one side of the country to the other. Sure, it wasn't as fast as the railroads, but they did it in their own way. While their journey was incredibly difficult, it showed something about the car that few people realized before that point. It had a purpose. It gave you a sense of freedom. These guys picked their own route, visited all the towns they wanted to, moved through the country on their own terms, rather than being forced on a straight path. And because of this, because a car could go across the country, this machine that was disregarded by many as a toy or novelty kinda became something more. Now, after this whole adventure, Horatio went home with his wife to Vermont, which still kept breaking down. He never collected the $50 bet, which makes sense, honestly. This was never about the money, but he did end up spending a lot of money. Throughout all of this, he had spent $8,000, which in today's money is about $274,000. With the constant repairs, the incredibly inefficient fuel consumption, lodging costs, food, paying for Crocker to do all of this, it added up. But it proved that you could drive across the country if you really, really wanted to. Eventually, the Packard and Oldsmobile teams made it to New York. The Oldsmobile team was the slowest, but they had a cheeky way of trying to make the most out of this. They dipped their car tires in the Atlantic to try and claim that they had actually gone from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. So you know, that's the one that actually counts. The Packard team managed to make it in less time overall than Horatio, but they were still in second place. After all of this, with 3 separate teams now crossing the country successfully, more people became interested in the challenge. How fast could you make it from one side to the other? Several more attempts were made by different individuals, cutting the time down quite a bit, but there was clearly a demand for better infrastructure. As cars got cheaper and more people started buying them, there was more incentive to build better roads. And by 1913, the first transcontinental highway was built, the Lincoln Highway. It would take a few more decades for the modern road systems of the US to be built, and even today they still aren't perfect. But if you want to drive from one end of the country to the other, it's a lot easier. This moment, though, in 1903, is still something special. The country that Horatio drove through was really one at the end of an era, a country before modern transportation, one of small, isolated towns, and Horatio got to see a lot of it. And while his intentions were just to prove this one guy wrong, he kind of ended up proving his point to the whole country. After this whole experience, Crocker wanted to try something more ambitious, to go around the world in a car. However, that never really worked out for him. Before he got the chance, he fell ill and died rather young. Horatio Jackson continued being Horatio Jackson, having a successful set of business ventures, but still seeking adventure. He found it in World War I, where he enlisted at the age of 42, going on to be a decorated soldier. In 1944, he donated the Vermont to the Smithsonian. From then on, he would occasionally go and visit his old car at the museum. Horatio's achievements are some of the most bizarre in American history, in all of exploration, actually. Most of these accomplishments in human history are fueled by grand aspirations of fame, wealth, or political edge. But this was a man taking on one of the greatest challenges of the time because he wanted to win an argument, because he liked cars, because he thought it would be fun. And that is Horatio Nelson Jackson. private social club, a lively debate was about to begin. Club members were fixated on a discussion about cars. The question was whether these new horseless carriages could ever replace the horse.